Hi, I'm Reed Abbott. I'm the Great Plains Regional Agronomist for AgroLiquid, and I come to you today from a cotton field just west of College Station, Texas. It's about ready to be harvested. As we move into the harvest and post-harvest season of the year, we like to take a look at our nutrient programs and how we can improve on those going into next year to achieve even greater yields. One of the nutrients that we like to focus on and have been focusing on for the last 5 or 10 years is our sulfur levels. I'd like to talk to you today about the importance of sulfur and its role in the soil and in the crop production. When we take a look at the sulfur cycle, there's many different sources of sulfur in the soil. Organic matter, which on a soil test for every 1% supplies about 2 to 3 pounds of sulfur, is very significant when we're talking about recommendations for sulfur. There's also soil minerals, which provide inorganic sources of sulfur that can then be converted over into sulfate, which is the plant available form of sulfur. There's atmospheric deposition. Atmospheric deposition is much less now, but it still can be a significant form of sulfur that is deposited on our croplands in certain areas of the country. Manures, irrigation water, and then finally fertilizer and amendment sources of sulfur can also provide great amounts of sulfur for our crop production. When we talk about sulfate being the plant available form of sulfur, there's plenty of loss pathways for sulfur in the soil. Bacteria utilize sulfate for respiration in low oxygen environments or saturated soils by forming hydrogen sulfide, which is susceptible to volatilization. This is that swampy smell that you get when you're in those particular areas. Sulfate is also not tightly held by the soil except in acid or clay soils, and therefore it can leach. Finally, the best loss pathway, at least for crop production purposes, would be crop harvest, which we hope is the most significant form of loss of sulfate in the soil. When we take a look at a sulfur soil tests generally don't test for just sulfate. They test for all forms of sulfur in the soil. So you have to do a little bit of reading in between the lines to get an accurate portrayal of how much plant available sulfate is in the soil. Conditions in the soil can falsely elevate sulfur levels in the soil. Elevated CECs or poor base saturations can cause sulfur to accumulate or exist in an unavailable form. Remember, sulfur exists in many forms, but only sulfate is the plant available form. So again, by testing all forms of sulfur, we have to kind of read between the lines to see how much that would be plant available. There's many different fertilizer and amendment sources of sulfur. Elemental sulfur is generally applied to acidify the soil and realign some of the base saturation percentages. Gypsum is also utilized to amend the soil and kind of realign those calcium and magnesium levels. There's ammonium sulfate, ammonium thiosulfate, potassium sulfate, potassium thiosulfate, sulfomag, superphosphate, and Epsom salt, which all contain sulfate forms of sulfur. Sulfur's role in the soil. Sulfur is very effective at removing sodium and other cations in excess from the soil. Again, that's the raw sulfur or elemental sulfur form of sulfur. When applied to the soil, elemental sulfur has an acidifying effect that occurs during the bacterial oxidation process. The release of hydrogen ions during the oxidation process lowers the pH and affects the base saturation percentages on the CEC complex. Lowering the pH can increase the availability of other plant essential nutrients in high pH or calcareous soils. Sulfate is used for many different things within the plant, but it's primarily used in the formation of amino acids, proteins, and oils in the crop. It's necessary for chlorophyll production, and it promotes nodulation in legumes, and it develops and activates certain proteins and vitamins within the cell. Its demand is very closely associated with the crop's demand for nitrogen, due to the role in protein and chlorophyll building, as well as sulfur's role in converting nitrate into amino acids. Crops generally use a 1 to 10 to 1 to 14 ratio of sulfur to nitrogen. There's many different crops that have a high response to sulfur as well. Alfalfa, broccoli, cabbage, as well as your cereal grains, sugar beet, sugarcane, watermelon, and even turnips. So many different crops utilize sulfur in abundance. Sulfur deficiency shows up as a yellowing of the younger or top growth of the plant due to its immobility within the plant. The plants typically show up shorter in stature with a reduced growth rate and reduced yield. Again, those symptoms are very often mistaken for nitrogen, but how you can tell that apart is nitrogen deficiency typically shows up on the lower, older leaves, where sulfur, again, due to its immobility within the plant, shows up with yellower leaves up top or in the newer growth. Thank you very much for watching today's video about the importance of sulfur in crop production. If you have any questions, please contact one of our retailers or our sales account managers or agronomists, or you can find more information at www.agroliquid.com. Thanks.